All right, so chapter 9. Byzantium, Eastern Europe. Maybe. Possibly. There it is. All right, quick overview of Byzantium. First, let's talk about where this name comes from. It comes from the city that this empire was originally built on. They took an old Roman city and pretty much covered it up with a brand new town. But they kept the town's name, Byzantium. Oh, it's a Greek name, I believe. I could be wrong. Again, my etymology is not what it should be. Right. Now, over time, Byzantium, the city, will grow to become Byzantium, the empire, the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And who sets that thing up? Constantine. Same guy that begins the process of embracing Christianity. Again, it comes a little bit too late to save Rome from decline. But it does then provide a safe place for Christianity to begin to develop. The other thing that Byzantium is going to do, because it doesn't fall when Greece does. Sorry, thank you. The other thing that it does when Rome falls is it preserves a lot of the culture and the learning that was part of the Roman Empire. And so much like when we talked about Arab civilization and how the Arabs preserved a lot of Greek and Roman learning, the Byzantines are going to preserve a lot of what was Greek and Roman. Right. Now, from a geographic standpoint, I'm assuming that if we said Eastern Europe, most of you could point to the general part of the world where you think Eastern Europe is. But as is often the case, vague is just not good enough in here. We need to be more specific. And in this case, that means knowing the specific geographic location of Byzantium, the Balkan Peninsula. And we'll come back to this, so don't panic. But I want to show you specifically what we're talking about when we say the Balkan Peninsula. When we talk about the Balkan Peninsula, we're talking about this peninsula of land sticking out into the Mediterranean. Now, today, what countries would you find here?
Greece.
All right, Greece predominantly, which would make up the southern tip of the Balkan Peninsula.
Greece, Serbia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria.
Good.
Republic.
A lot of small Eastern European nations that at one point, many of which were controlled by the Soviet Union, make up other parts of the Balkan Peninsula. But it's this piece of land that we refer to when we talk about the Balkan Peninsula. It's a word you're going to hear come up time and time again. So you might as well familiarize yourself with it now. And even though Byzantium begins on this ancient Roman city of Byzantium, that will not remain the center of the empire for long. Instead, the capital will move to the city founded specifically by the Emperor Constantine and named in his honor, Constantinople. And what's really cool about Constantinople, at least what I think is really cool, and I'm a big history nerd, so, gauge your opinion accordingly. It is still a major city today. It is still a major global city of trade and culture. And what's really cool about Constantinople is it literally bridges two continents. It's on the line between Europe and Asia. The eastern half of the city is in Asia. The western half of the city is in Europe. It bridges cultures. It bridges worlds. And that's actually where I'm taking students this summer. And I can't wait to see a city that has been shaped by being in that part of the world.
Has it already been decided who's going?
Nope.
How long does it stay?
A week and a half. And so the other things that are cool about Byzantium and about Constantinople is because of where it is, because it's centered on all of these, or centered around all of these other cultures, there's a great deal of contact. This is not China. This is not China way off in Eastern Asia, geographically isolated, politically disinterested in other cultures. This is smack dab in the middle of any number of civilizations that have been great or are great. So it's coming on the heels of Rome. Persia's next door. The rising Arab civilization is just to the south, and the emerging Kievan Rus are to the northeast. I mean, this is smack dab in the middle of so many great cultures. Yes, sir?
Is it like the melting pot of the world at the time?
It is.
And this is like the new melting pot of the U.S.
Yes, we are. And the last interesting thing, just as we're kind of looking at Byzantium as an overview, is that they really don't have a lot of contact with Western Europe once Rome falls. They kind of cut ties with where they came from. Home for them is no longer Rome. They don't associate themselves with Western Europe. And other than a brief attempt at reclaiming what used to be the Roman Empire, they really do just focus solely on being in Eastern Europe. And so as we talk about this melting pot that they seem to create, Western Europe's not really included. And so as you get to the next chapter, chapter 10, it's going to be interesting to see how Western Europe differs from Eastern Europe. There's actually a rivalry that develops. Western Europe kind of starts to dislike Byzantium. Byzantium actually becomes the destination of one of the 9 crusades sent by the Catholic Pope. They're like, yeah, we've had enough of this Jerusalem thing. Let's go try to capture Constantinople. Yes, sir?
It wasn't about the Pope, but the Venetian merchants who had the Crusaders attack Constantinople?
Yes. You are correct. Technically not the Pope. Right.
They say that themselves probably had enough of
Well, that's probably true too. You can only lose so many times before you get tired of it. All right, are we good here? All right, hearing no complaints. All right, so when we talk about Byzantium, one of the things that we have to discuss is government. And when we talk about Byzantium's government, it has quite the run. Now, sadly, it's really hard to look at it as anything other than a long, slow decline. But the fact that it sticks around for 1,000+ years, I mean, that's pretty impressive. Long, slow decline or not, 1,000 years is amazing. I mean, how long has the United States been around? As an actual unified political entity.
Yeah, around 200 or so years.
All right, 200+ years.
230.
Right. So we'll hit the 250 mark in another decade or so. So 4 times longer than the United States has been around is how long Byzantium has existed. I find that impressive. And their power began even before Rome fell. Emperors ruled from Byzantium before the barbarian hordes had finished invading and conquering Rome itself. And so we're going to see a little bit of a chronological overlap between the end of Rome and the beginning of Byzantium. So I know oftentimes in history it's easy to think, all right, this thing started, and then it stopped, and then this new thing started, and then it stopped, and then the next thing started. We tend to break it up into segments. We don't really like overlap when we talk about history. We have a hard time envisioning that this thing was happening, and then while that was happening, a new thing started, and then the first thing kind of tailed off, but the second thing continued. That gets confusing for us. But that's one of the things that you're going to have to kind of work through. Byzantium is up and running and functioning and becoming powerful, even though Rome is still around. There is no finite end and beginning, as one stops and the next begins. Yeah. Kind of. Already we were beginning to see a divergence in political practice, in culture, in wealth. And again, it makes it so much messier. Because it would be so much easier if we could just say, all right, Rome was here and then Rome stopped. Done. And now Byzantium's going to start. Look how nice and clean this is. And it doesn't work that way. So, at what point does Byzantium stop being Roman and start being entirely Byzantium? We can't point to a single year and be like, here it was. June 23rd, 452. Flip the switch. This is oftentimes why when you guys get to high school history, you feel like your earlier teachers lied to you. Because you start to find out things that aren't necessarily true. Like, I know some of your teachers probably taught you that Columbus landed in America, and you thought that meant here. And then you found out later it's, some island in the Caribbean. You guys learned in like first and second grade that Washington and Lincoln and Martin Luther King were all friends and hung out together. Because that was the way that your teacher helped you understand that these are three important men that shaped our country. And then you learn later that's not true, and you're like, oh, God, they lied to us. No, they didn't. They made it easier for you to learn.
Well, that Washington, Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln,
right. So again, unfortunately, we're just now at the point where you're learning messy history. Because you're learning history as it happened. Instead of we're going to take out this section and take out this section and give you the nice, easy, condensed version. Now, one of the great early emperors of Byzantium, you guys learned about him last year, Justinian. What are some of Justinian's major accomplishments, Nick?
The Justinian Code. He had the Hagia Sophia, giant church, which is now a mosque.
Right.
Which is now a museum.
Right.
Constructed. And he had his best general, got his name, so to speak, try and reconquer back most of the Roman Empire, which they did succeed with the exception of France and Britain.
Good. Anything else you guys remember from last year? You left something out? What?
He's constantly scheming and doing stuff in his best interests, like taking the pay that families would get after their soldiers, after a soldier and their family died, to go and fund more troops.
Right. He was not the most trusting man, nor was he the most sympathetic to other people.
He also contacted the
Right. He had it coming, though. Karma sucks. All right, so, what's that? Yeah.
He survived, but probably changed him up a bit.
I would imagine. All right, so when we look at Justinian's code, what will we imagine it's based off of? All right, Rome's 12 tables. So there's one of the places where you see the continuation of Roman culture. Building the Hagia Sophia, again, it's in keeping with Rome's monumental architectural styles. Instead of this being a temple to the Roman gods, however, here you have, essentially a temple to the Christian God. So similar themes, but now putting a new twist on them. Now, I'm assuming you guys know who this lovely lady is? All right, his wife, Theodora. Now, anytime that you have a woman in power, especially in these early civilizations, it's worth talking about. Why? Because it's not usual. It doesn't happen very often. But is it fair to start making broad statements about gender roles simply because there's a woman or a couple of women that hold power? No. I mean, does this open the door? Does this shatter the glass ceiling to allow any woman that wants to pursue a political career? No. So again, it's the gender exception rather than the rule. So when we ask you the question, compare, gender roles and responsibilities in Byzantium and Rome, please do not say, well, in Byzantium, any woman could grow up to be, the empress of the entire empire. Because look at Theodora and the other Theodora. I mean, they did it, so clearly any woman could, so women's lives were getting better. No. Good attempt, but we're reading too much into it at that point. Right. Now, it is also interesting to note that Theodora does have a great deal of influence on Justinian. And this is where we get a nice illustration of the power that women did command in societies around the world. And it's the same gender relationship that you see today. When a man and a woman are married and live together, there's give and take. There's conversation, there's compromise, there's discussion. And so regardless of what the man's public title is, when he gets home, his title is husband. And her title is wife. And that conveys so much more equality than emperor. And so it would not be uncommon in households around the world, in social classes from top to bottom, that within the comfort of your home, a woman's probably going to have far more influence than the history books tell us. Because Justinian comes home from a hard day of ruling his empire. He's like, God, I can't believe my generals suck so much. Why couldn't they just have won this battle? God, so upset. And Theodora's like, that guy's a jerk. He shouldn't be your general. You should fire him and bring in this other guy. We've known him for a while. He's a good guy. And Justinian's like, yeah, you're right. That would be a good idea. So the next day, I am making an official proclamation. You are fired, you are hired. I did this all on my own. No, I didn't. My wife told me to. That's the kind of influence that a woman would have, whether from an upper class or a lower class marriage. Now, does it always work that way? No. But more often than not. Now, I'm curious to know, how many of you read? Hey, we're getting a few people back. Not bad. Welcome. It's good to have you. All right, so somebody that read, tell me about the other Theodora. Because there's two Theodoras that show up, and this sometimes gets confusing. No? So, nobody knows because they didn't read, nobody knows because it was confusing, or nobody's volunteering because it makes total sense and we don't need to discuss it. Stephen! Whose sister? Okay. Yes. Right. 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 Not bad. Say it again, Stephen.
All right. So, I get to hold it. All right. All right. Okay, this is for everybody. Hi, Mom. Okay, so there's it's, let's say 980, 70 something, all right? And there's an emperor, and he's married to this empress called Zoe, which is Theodora's sister. Okay, and Theodora, we'll just say she was persuasive. So and so Zoe locked Theodora up, so she wouldn't like per se bewitch the emperor. Eventually, Theodora gets out and bewitches the emperor. Air quotes.
Good. Lovely. Okay, so really the reason we're talking about the other Theodora, nice work, Stephen. The reason we're talking about the other Theodora is because it would seem like with a second example of a woman in power, maybe this is a trend. Maybe women do have more opportunities than we typically give them credit for. Maybe women's status is improving, especially in this Byzantine Empire. But based on the story that Stephen just told us, again, is this the norm or is this an exception? It's an exception. All right, here we have a manipulative, scheming woman. Well, I guess you could say both of them were, Zoe and the other Theodora. There were two Theodoras. Relatively common name.
They were sisters?
No, Zoe and the second Theodora.
Wait, when was the first one?
She died. She was earlier.
Oh, okay.
And again, this is why it's oftentimes confusing, because history books don't use names that often.
I just didn't know the other Theodora and Zoe were from different
Right.
family altogether.
And that's why we discuss it.
That-
So, same name, not happening at the same time.
So, okay, so, hang on.
Okay.
So Theodora and the other Theodora have no connection.
Right.
Then why is she important?
That's what we're getting to. Emily?
So one of them was Justinian's wife, and the other one was the sister of Zoe.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so this...
No, Zoe was like
All right, let's try this again.
300, 300 or 400.
This Theodora is married to Justinian. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. When is Justinian ruling? Ish.
500.
All right, in the 500s. So when is this Theodora alive?
The 500.
500s. Fast forward to this Theodora, whose sister Zoe initially makes a smart marriage move and ends up with a great deal of political influence over, at the time, the emperor. And then through a series of episodes that could probably have also aired on the Jersey Shore or Desperate Housewives, you eventually have the Zoe and Theodora II, if we want to call her that.
Theodora.
They have their sibling rivalry. That thing all works out. And in the end, the other Theodora ends up winning out and, for a brief time, ruling as empress. Eileen? No. If you know Zoe and Theodora 2.0, that's good enough.
Wait, so basically, one question. Did
Sure.
Zoe have any role in being empress at all? I was...
You mean, was she for a time?
Yes. Or, I just don't know how Zoe plays into all this. Like, if the sibling rivalry, what did she do to the other Theodora?
As Stephen told us in his story, Zoe has Theodora locked away so that she could not attempt to seduce Zoe's husband. And lo and behold, the plan doesn't work, and Theodora gets out and seduces Zoe's husband, and eventually Theodora...
Emperor?
Right.
Okay.
So what happens to Zoe?
Stephen, do you remember what happens to Zoe? I don't think it says either. Defenestrated, maybe. She might have been defenestrated.
Oh, that's lovely.
Thrown out a window. It's one of my all-time favorite words because it sounds so much more gruesome than it actually is.
Yes, it does.
Defenestrated. Yeah,
Thrown out the window.
thrown out a window. Well, depending on how high up the window is, but... All right, anyway. last thing to talk about with Byzantium's bureaucracy, again, in the spirit of comparison, which is what we're all about and will be about for the remainder of the year, one way that Byzantium and China are both similar is that they both make use of a bureaucracy that allows opportunities for lower class people to join. Probably not, but
Have a new one.
here you go.
Hold on a moment. No, that looks like it was replaced. Or did you have the old brown one there before?
I have no idea. I'm in here for one period. Okay. Anyway, simply because the opportunity exists for lower class people to join doesn't mean it happens often. About how similar the government was to China? Because the only thing we talk about is China. And the only thing we talk about is government. And then we wouldn't have much else to say. So it would be a fairly short Socratic seminar. You're right, though. And this is hopefully something that you will realize about your textbook the more that you actually read it, is that your book will actually help you make a lot of these comparisons. Because they will say, hey, this is a lot like China. Or this is a lot like India. Or this is a lot like Korea, once we've actually learned about Korea. All right, do we have questions here? Yes, ma'am.
Hang on.
Sure.
So, the second Theodora was the Empress.
Yes.
Was that like?
It was centuries later.
No.
Let her ask the question. Right.
Was that like did that happen in other empires than just in Byzantium where empresses?
Yes. Yes. And again, it's usually going to happen as a result of marriage where the husband dies. And so rather than risk civil war or the potential overthrow of that ruling family, the woman for a time will take power. It happens occasionally in China. It happens, I think, a couple of times in Rome. No, it's going to happen a few times in civilizations, mostly just to maintain continuity and avoid, the huge upheaval that would take place by having to bring in a new dynasty or elect and or appoint and or fight to have a new ruler put in power. Hang on one second. Yes, Nick.
Are there any examples in the rest of the world, like what happened in England after King Henry VIII, where you had the only viable heirs were women married to stocks and kings first?
Yeah, often. And so again, that's where marriages that take place because of political alliance will come into play. That's where a regent may become necessary. So we put the daughter up there in name only, but we're going to have a guy actually make all the decisions. All kinds of possible options at this point. But, look at the math, if nothing else. What are the odds that at some point something like that would have to happen?
Low.
Well, they may be low, but it's an impossibility to assume that a male would always be able to be in power in all of these situations around the world throughout history. At some point, a woman would have to assume control.
So is it something like in the Empress Theodora's case, okay, well let's do the Emperor's wife take over, so until she has some sons, the eldest can take over, or she marries someone who takes over,
Right.
the co-rule or something.
Yep. James?
We think that we're eventually going to get a female president here in the U.S.
Wouldn't be surprised. I mean, you look at the last couple elections. I mean, you had female vice presidential candidates. You almost had Hillary Clinton as a presidential candidate. So, would not be surprising at all. And in this election, before Mitt Romney picked Paul Ryan as his vice president, there was talk he was going to pick Condoleezza Rice. So we almost had a female vice presidential candidate again. So it seems like we're going in that direction.
We could have had one in 2008 election too, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, so fun with maps.
Yay, map.
This is the Empire of Justinian, which is the top of the two maps in the worksheet I gave you. So to help us understand what's happening here. From the west, helping to end the Roman Empire, we have the Germanic tribes. From the southeast, we do not have Muslims yet, which is part of the reason why Justinian's empire is able to be so extensive. If you look at the time frame, when Justinian comes to power in 527 and when he dies in 565, by the time he dies, who's still not even born yet? Muhammad. Muhammad still isn't around, which means there can be no Arab Empire, which means Byzantium has free and clear opportunities to take over those parts of what we call the Middle East and North Africa. Now, they do still have to deal with the Persians, but again, the Persians seem to be a declining influence at this point in history. Yes, sir? Did who? Byzantium? Oh, yeah. Their army was fantastic, especially as they continue to grow stronger. You know, success breeds success. Yeah.
The Byzantine army, was it literally just the Roman army under a different name? Did they have different ways of equipping and using their troops?
I am glad you asked, and we're going to get to that under technology. I don't want to spoil the ending. It's a good ending. Emily? No, because in our next map... Yes, it's moving. I know. It's exciting.
Why did they lose so much territory at that one short period of time?
Well, again, as it recycles, give it a moment. Wait for it. Wait for it. All right, so at its inception, you've got all this. Look at the dates. 550. And now as we jump to 717, what's happened by this point?
Muslims.
All right. The Umayyad and Abbasid Empire.
Take back most of the Balkans in 1000.
Because they're trying to reclaim again. Anytime that you have civilizations in decline, there's always a point in the decline where somebody takes power under the promise of, we are going to reclaim what we once had. We are going to make ourselves great again. And you get all the troops fired up, and everybody's waving their flags and cheering, and they're singing patriotic songs, and you see the attempt to re-expand and attempt to reclaim what they had. Because this was the peak with Justinian. And then the Arabs show up, and they lose all of this, and they fall back. So again, we're going to try, but by that point, those fringe societies had simply become too powerful. Well, the map is also in your book, David. Yeah. And so to answer some more of your question about what was happening at this point, as we fast forward about 500 years after Justinian, and we find them being limited to now just territory around the Balkan Peninsula and into Turkey, or what we call Anatolia at the time, we're going to see that by this point, we're pretty much past the threat of the Abbasids, but now it's the Ottoman Turks that are threatening from the east. A new Muslim civilization that has just as big an issue with Byzantium as the Arabs did. So again, sometimes maps tell a bigger story. Yeah, it's on Vision. Yep. So sometimes the maps tell more of a story than we realize. It's not just a way to notice geography. It's not just about identifying land features and labeling oceans and other bodies of water. Just by looking at the boundaries of this civilization over a span of 500 years, it's really not terribly difficult to figure out what was happening and why. And I know oftentimes when you guys get in the textbook, any page that doesn't have text there's like a little mini party that happens in your head, and you're like, yeah, I don't have to read. I mean, the yellow box, the blue box, the brown box, sometimes the introductory page, anything with a picture. You're like, yeah, less to read. I'm going to get done with this page so fast.
And then you go the next.
You're missing out on a lot of great additional information, because things like these maps and things like the pictures and things like the supplemental boxes, they really will enrich your understanding of the topic. They're in there for a reason. They were not getting paid by the page to make this textbook. They didn't put it in there as filler so they could make a couple extra bucks. If they could have made the book smaller and lighter, they probably would have done it. They put those things in there because they felt they were beneficial. Yes, sir?
Is that island of Rose right there where we get the cave name or diamond?
No.
However you say it.
All right. The other thing we have to talk about with Byzantium is religion. And so we're going to touch base again on some of the questions from the reading quiz, specifically this issue of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, early in its inception, Christianity didn't have much variation. There may have been, through the practice of blending a new religion with local practices, and what do we call that blending? Syncretism. Lovely. There may have been some local variations in terms of particular ceremonies or practices or things like that, but there was only one branch of Christianity until we have this dispute between the church in Rome and the church in Constantinople. And they fight over a couple of things. And on the surface, this may seem like a ridiculous fight. And for people that aren't necessarily religious, any religious fight may seem kind of dumb. I mean, for people who aren't Muslim, when we talked about the Shia-Sunni split, some of you may have been thinking, all right, why does it matter? Just pick a guy.
Some people are really devoted.
Well, and that's the issue with religion. A lot of people are really devoted. And, you know, some people have a hard enough time breaking their own traditions and habits in their own life. I mean, you put your right shoe on first every day. If somebody told you to put your left shoe on, you'd have a mini meltdown.
Or you just forget about it while trying to.
You take that same premise and expand it to something like religion. Something that impacts not only your daily routine, but the very fabric of your being. And not just of this life, but of the next life, whatever comes next. Now all of a sudden, this is a very big thing to mess with. You know, we've talked about, as you know, religions have spread through trade and through conquest. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. How come people didn't convert more often, or how come they did? I'm hoping you've begun to realize just how big a decision conversion is. Because religion gives you a worldview. It gives you a perspective on life and why we're here and where we're going. And to just all of a sudden one day wake up and be like, I'm not really feeling Christian today. I think I'm going to be Buddhist. I mean, you don't change that like you change your clothes. These are things that people feel very fiercely protective about. And so while some of these, religious spats may seem a little bit comical, you need to realize that these aren't people that are fighting just to fight. They are fighting to preserve something that is integral to who they are as both individual people and as a civilization. So when we look at the Eastern Church now getting really upset over this issue of iconoclasm, when they're having Mass in the Eastern Church, they like bringing in these large images, 3-4 foot tall pictures of the saints or the Virgin Mary, so that the worshipers in the service can visualize who they're talking about and who they're directing their prayers to.
Or at least get some idea of what the person is.
Right. And you guys know this. You're visual learners. You like pictures, even though you skip through them in the textbook. You would be bored if all we had were words up there. You like being able to associate visually what you're learning about. But the Western Church, the church in Rome, said, no, no icons. Icons are like idols, and as right, and as the commandments told us, thou shalt not create any graven image. Thou shalt have no other gods. Thou shalt not worship false idols. And the Eastern Church is like, we're not worshiping false idols. We're worshiping the same God. We just have a picture of some of these people to help the audience. And the Western Church is like, no, you're breaking the commandment. You're bad people. Your way of doing things is wrong.
I am excommunicating.
Right. Yes, Dave.
It's kind of critical when they have the so-called possessions or something at the same.
Well, and again, this is where religion can get, a little bit feisty, because people so firmly believe what they believe in. There isn't a lot of gray for many of these people, especially people in the church. I mean, this is their job. It's like if somebody random walked in and started being like, you know what, you shouldn't teach like this. You should have them stand up on their desks, and they should be waving things around and coloring on the walls with markers and finger painting, and be like, are you friggin' nuts? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Well, no, not really. Oh, okay. I mean, these are people in the church that are debating this. This is their job. This is their life. These are the experts on faith. And they're saying, no, you can't have icons. And the people in the Eastern Church are like, yes, we can. We're in the church too. And they also have this issue with clerical celibacy. Now, in the Western Church, when you become a priest, the rules say you are making a sacrifice. You are making an earthly sacrifice to be closer to God and to serve God. And so guess what? That means you don't get to have a life like every other normal person. And that is a sacrifice that you make voluntarily, and it's a good thing. And you need to honor that. And so one of the things that you are going to give up as a man entering the church to be a priest, you are giving up ever having a family. You will not marry. You will not father children. You will not practice fathering children. Yes, sir?
Wait,
The no marrying thing was Western. The Eastern Church says, look, these are men. These are men like any other men. They have urges. They have desires. They want to have families. They want to have wives. They want to have kids. And just because they love God and want to share God's message shouldn't mean they can't do that. Western Church says that's actually exactly what it means. They are making this sacrifice for their faith. They don't get to have a life like everybody else. Eastern Church says, yes, they do. Western Church says, no, they don't. Eastern Church says, well, your mother. And so this is where we see a split between East and West. This is where we have a split in the tree of Christianity. And so we now have two branches: Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. And from here they will split again and 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 again until today we've got 30, 40 plus denominations. You guys took your PSAT on Wednesday, right? When you flip the packet over to pick your religion. I mean, how many of you were shocked that there were that many religious options?
For just one thing, for something that stems from a single point.
Mm-hmm. But again, this is how seriously people take their faith. That these differences matter. Yes, Nick?
Did Eastern Orthodoxy ever have a split amongst itself, like Roman Catholicism did with the Protestant?
Well, then you end up with Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, as well as the generic Orthodox Church. So, yeah.
Like the Orthodox, where it's not centered in one region.
Right. Okay. Other fun things. You know how we talked about Byzantium being kind of a melting pot of cultures? You see it here as well with the language. You're going to see this conflux. Conflux means the meeting point, the joining. If you talk about the conflux of two rivers, it's the point where two rivers meet and move on together. We should talk about time machines more often, I think. It's a greatly overlooked topic of conversation. All right, so what you see in Byzantium, again, think about where it is in the world. It's centered on, the old Greek civilization. It's a descendant of Roman civilization. So this is the conflux of Latin and Greek cultures. And so Byzantium is going to an extent, preserve both of them. On a completely unrelated note, because we like to talk about merchants in many of these societies, quick review, merchants in China are dirt, ostracized, bad, shunned, pick your adjective, good. Merchants in India are good, celebrated, valued, high caste. Merchants in Rome are necessary and quite wealthy. Merchants in Byzantium are numerous, but also, compared to the strength of the government, relatively powerless. Merchants will conduct very necessary trade. Many, many merchants will be quite necessary, again, given all of the places that Byzantium has to trade with. But merchants will not wield a great deal of power. Yes, ma'am. I hate it when you guys ask good questions. That's all right. Largely because I would imagine that because the government is such a strong descendant of the Roman government, power is already held very, very strongly in the hands of a few. So the emperor, his bureaucrats, his advisors, the administrators of the government. Merchants are going to rarely have the opportunity to move up into that class. Now, if you look at our government today, if you look at the people that become politicians, they are oftentimes quote-unquote merchants that have been successful. They are successful businessmen that then move into politics. What we don't see in earlier civilizations are the opportunities for that kind of upward mobility. Just because you are a successful, wealthy merchant doesn't mean that you can all of a sudden rule the government. They are going to keep those social classes fairly separate in a way that does not happen today. All right, we good there? Lovely. Economics, or as my college economics professor said, economics. And so now every time I say the word, I have to stop and think about how to say it correctly. It gets stuck in your head. It's weird. I would imagine. All right, again, because of where it is in the world, Constantinople becomes a major center for global trade. It's smack dab in the middle between Western Europe, Asia, and the Arab civilization. They are surrounded on all sides by people that either want to engage in trade or have things to trade, are very wealthy or desire to become wealthy. It's a great spot to be. James.
In the picture, aren't they worried they might drop those bombs in the water?
Probably not, because I think it's metaphorical. But
Yeah, but
in reality, it would certainly be a concern.
yeah.
Nick.
How does war with another civilization create trade? It's almost counterintuitive.
It seems counterintuitive at first, but, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Crusades. One second. No, it's during war. You think about any time that armies are sent any place, it's typically to a different culture. And so when those soldiers, when those generals, when the support staff goes to that place, yes, they're there to fight, but they're also people.
They're not going to trash the place.
Well, not even that, but they are going to notice things that are different. Take like the Olympic athletes going to London for the games. They are there to compete, whether it's on a field, in a pool, on a gymnastics mat, whatever. They are there to compete and to win, to fight for their country. But guess what happens when they go to London? They sightsee. They go to a pub and they try, warm English beer. And they eat some of the food, a little bit of bangers and mash or fish and chips. They take in a show or two. They go to the parks. They absorb that culture. They buy some Manchester United gear just because it's cool and it's there. And they bring it back home. And they tell their friends. You do the vacation slideshow. War promotes trade, because even as you go to these places to fight for your country, you can't help but notice what the other place has. In chapter 10, when you learn about Western Europe, you're going to learn about the Crusades for several pages. And one of the things that they're going to tell you about the Crusades is that when Western Europeans go to the Holy Land, to kill Muslims in the name of God, they're going to go, holy crap, the Muslims have cool stuff. Look at their buildings, look at their clothes, look at their food, look at their technology. They are amazing, but we're here to kill them. But they're amazing. But they're the enemy, but they're amazing. And so even as we are fighting them and killing them, we go back home and we're telling our friends, yeah, we killed them, but you should have seen their stuff.
You kill them and you take their stuff.
Or in some cases, you kill them and you take their stuff.
Excuse me?
Yes, sir.
So when it says like the war promotes trade while the war is going on, is it like a conquered area of like the war or something, or you're currently occupying, you trade with people there in that area?
You're still thinking a little too literally.
Okay.
There will be a little bit of trade during the downtimes in the fighting and when the war is over. But war creates an opportunity for exposure to other cultures.
To like try and imitate or copy?
Right.
To make it for yourself?
Right. Europeans are going to go to the Holy Land and they're going to see Arab castles and they're going to go back home and be like, we should build a castle. And before you know it, castles pop up all over Western Europe. They're going to look at the siege engines that Arabs use to fight in the Holy Land. They're going to go back home and be like, we should make siege engines because we fight each other all the time. They look at the Arab swords and they're like, man, we should figure out how to make a sword using their kind of metal. And they never can quite do it, but they keep trying. So that's how war creates trade.
Isn't that metal like the Damascus or something?
Yeah, the Damascene swords.
Another question.
Sure.
Or I find it kind of ironic that like the places that have been more backwater until like recent millennia or centuries seem to be like better places to live than the more advanced parts of the world.
Well, one of the things that we find as we study history more is history certainly is cyclical. It does go in cycles, and so places that used to be great are going to have a period where they're not so great. And people, places that used to be pretty awful suddenly become relevant and awesome, and then they're
More like it seems like with American, not so awful, but not so advanced.
right. You see it with fashion all the time. Things seem to go in 10 or 15 or 20 year cycles, and stuff that your parents were wearing that was actually cool, like paisley prints. Like the flower stuff, right? Pastel colors, polyester. Thank God that hasn't come back yet. But these things seem to come in cycles. All right, so we good here? Well, it goes from bell bottoms. You shrink it a little bit, you call it boot cut, and now all of a sudden it's trendy. Yeah.
So when you say Russia, do you mean like where modern day Russia?
I mean where Western modern day Russia is. So not like the entire northern expanse of Asia, but like Moscow and west. Early on, they are known as the Kievan Rus, and that will then turn into Russia. Yes, sir.
They're called Russian. If they're Kiev and Rus, then why is Kiev the capital of Ukraine?
Because it wasn't always Ukraine. Does that work for you? Well, political borders change over time. And so at one point, Kiev was included in this early Russian Empire. And then later, empires break up, as we've seen many other times.
Is this Russia that the Bureaucracy extends into?
Yep.
The Russian part of Europe?
Yep.
Okay. And it doesn't really head into the Asian part of Russia at all?
Correct.
European part of Russia?
Well, the Asian part of Russia doesn't really get going until the Russian Empire begins, which is not going to be until the 15 and 1600s. Right, until the Tsars come in. Okay, so a quick look with all these different groups that the Byzantines deal with. And I know this is a lot, and we're just about done. You guys have been troopers today. when we look at Byzantium interacting with its Muslim neighbors, first the Arabs and then the Turks, this was always the greatest threat to Byzantium. These were always the people that were absolutely set on conquering Byzantium. Yes, Nick?
Why did they have such an OCD with
You could say it's the religious conflict. You could say that it's a fight over very ideal geographical locations. You could say that it probably just came up at a time when it just so happened that empires were looking to expand, and they happened to be close to each other, and so there's only so much room to expand into. I mean, where would you rather go? Turkey and the Balkan Peninsula or North Africa? Right. And so some of it is a geopolitical decision. It's a question of, which geographical areas will give you the greatest benefit, wealth, and political power. Now, sadly, what this means is an ongoing series of wars between Byzantines and Arabs, and then later Byzantines and Turks. Wars are expensive. You need soldiers. You need weapons. You need supplies. You need food. You need to pay the soldiers. You need to pay the families of the soldiers that die. And the funding for all of these wars, just like it does today, comes from taxes. And at this point in time, who pays, on a percentage basis, more taxes than anybody else? The peasants. The people that already have very little. And so, reoccurring wars are only going to hurt an already suffering lower class. And when the lower class, who is already suffering, begins to suffer more, guess what they oftentimes do? They revolt. Right, the pitchforks and the torches come out. Probably in, under their bed. That's where I keep my pitchfork and torch, just in case I need it. And so the end of this story is that Byzantium is finally and emphatically conquered in 1453 by the Ottomans. There's actually a really cool story about this battle. They had Ottoman soldiers climbing in through the sewers to get inside the city at night since they didn't have a Trojan horse. They were dragging their ships across the Golden Horn. They would actually, set up these log rollers, and they took hundreds of soldiers and, tied lines to the ships and dragged them over land to get to the other side of the Bosporus Strait. It's the kind of movie battle, or it's the kind of battle that you would expect to see in a movie.
Do they use ships to pull log rafts across the strait?
No, they use logs to roll their ships out of the water, across land, and into the next body of water so they could attack the city from both sides.
So like they were just rolling along.
Uh-huh.
If the people of Constantinople were able to burn the Arabs with Greek fire the first time in 700, why was the 1453 one not a repeat of that?
I'm glad you asked, because on our technology page we're going to talk about Greek fire, but the short version is Greek fire became a lost technology.
What was Greek fire? Some sort of what?
We're going to talk about it on the technology page.
Oh, is there anyone with another page?
Yep. All right. Question? Okay. All right. Another cultural group to talk about is the Kievan Rus. Again, this will be the group that becomes Russia. We call Byzantium the second Rome. Russia is going to be the third Rome because of their close connection to Byzantium. So it's almost like a family tree. Rome is the grandfather, Byzantium is the son, and Russia is the grandson. If you look at the title of the Russian rulers eventually, they come to be known as czars. Right, which is an adaptation of Caesar. And that's only one of many, many things that the early Russian culture tried to adopt from.
Corruption of
Well, not a corruption, but a translation. And in addition to some of those political and social characteristics, you're also going to see the Russians adopt Eastern Orthodoxy, a tradition that continues today, which communism briefly destroyed, but it's on its way back. Yes, Nick?
Could you claim, based on that, could you claim that really the final aspect of the Roman Empire was destroyed in 1918 with the Soviet Revolution?
You could, in terms of the Caesar, but with Russian Orthodoxy alive and well, it's not completely gone. All right, and then conflicts with Western Europe. We talked about kind of the sibling rivalry between East and West and how they really end up not liking each other much. Again, something that you see play out throughout history into the World Wars and then even the Cold War. So this is going to be the beginning of a long, beautifully complex relationship between East and West.
Has there ever been like a time period in like the U.S. history so far where there's been like a decade or few where we haven't been in any real conflict with other countries or so?
There's probably been a decade.
Like, maybe like 2 decades or something like that.
I don't know about that long.
Like, notable period of time that
I think we've almost always been fighting somebody. Whether it was a sovereign nation or American Indian tribes or Central American islands or whatever. All right, last page. It's 2 bullet points.
Was that the technology?
Right.
I missed it.
Well, no, this is the technology page. All right, so when we talk about Byzantium, we have to talk about art and architecture, and they are conveniently fused into one building, the Hagia Sophia. A church that later becomes a mosque once the Ottomans invade and take over, but a building that demonstrates the best of the architectural technology at the time. A building that truly is a work of art.
Are you going to talk about how Greek fire was lost in the other?
Well, we're going to talk about Greek fire as kind of an urban legend. Nobody's really sure what Greek fire was when it existed. There are historical records of a weapon known as Greek fire, and there are descriptions of how that weapon may have been used. But the issue with historical records is bias. And you see this all the time with sporting events. If you ask members of 2 teams who won the game and how close was it, you're probably going to get 2 wildly different versions, right? You know, if you had a football game where the final score was 21-7, the winning team might say things like, "Oh, we completely destroyed them." And the losing team might say things like, "Man, we barely lost. They got lucky in a couple plays." So when we look at historical accounts of Greek fire, we're not entirely sure how to interpret them.
So is it like a primitive flamethrower from that?
Well, there are descriptions of Greek fire that say that it could be used on the water from ship to ship, and it was kind of an early version of napalm,
That's what I was thinking, napalm.
so that it would actually burn on top of the water, because you know how oil and water separate?
Is that what napalm is?
And so that this is a weapon that they could deploy from a ship and literally set fire to the top of the ocean and have, ships sail into the path of this fire, that they could burn ships, and sailors are bringing in buckets of water from over the side and they can't put out the fire because it's impervious to water. There are some accounts that say certain groups had learned to kind of re-engineer this technology, and that Greek fire shows its head at different times throughout history and then always disappears. The consensus seems to be that we don't know how to do it now and really haven't for a long time. But Greek fire is kind of one of those mythological weapons that comes up every once in a while and always seems to get blown horribly out of proportion. Yes, sir? There's proof that something called Greek fire was used, but exactly what it was, how it was made, what it could do, what it couldn't do, is the topic of a great deal of conversation. Yes, sir?
What is the latest known record